All right, hello. In this video, we're going to go over how to use events and state management in order to make React applications interactive. So this is how we're actually going to be able to make it so that when you click on buttons, that your page can change what it displays. We're going to start with a really simple example just to show off the syntax, and then we're going to go through more complex examples and sort of more integrated examples in later videos. In particular, the example we're going to start off with is a very simple cookie jar here, where I have an application, a cookie jar component that is able to display a number of cookies. It does this by having a count of how many cookies we want to display. It converts that into, it creates a number of image elements based on that count and then renders it as part of its component. We're able to take that count and display it on the screen. What we're going to make it happen is that we're going to make it so that when I click my bake cookie, I can add more cookies to my list, or when I click eat cookies, I can take more cookies off my list. That's how we're going to make it interactive. All right. So the first thing we need to do in order to make this interactive is we need to make it so that when I click these buttons, something happens. The way that we're going to do that in React is similar to how we did it with the DOM. We are going to add an event listener to respond to that button press. So in the DOM, what we would have done, right, is for around our button here is we would have called add event listener, specify I wanted a click event, and then I would have some function that would get called whenever I clicked on that button. We don't use the add event listener function in React. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create a special sort of special React specific prop called onClick. OnClick is a little bit like add event listener click. There's a similar on submit, on type, on input. There's a bunch of different on functions for every different kinds of event that's sort of built into HTML. So in this case, we can add ourselves a special prop to this button called onClick. The value that gets assigned to this prop is then going to be what is the function that we want to call. What function should exist, what should get called when I click on this button. Now, we're going to create that function inside of our component, right? So inside of our cookie jar component, right? Inside this function, we're going to make that click handling function as a sort of a special variable within this larger component. So just like we declared a count that was sort of a number variable here, or we declared an array variable here, we're going to create ourselves a new function variable. I'm going to call this one handle bake. Actually, we'll handle bake click because the baking kind of click. I got multiple buttons here. This is going to be a function that takes an event and specifies what we want to do. So this is going to be the same kind of thing we would normally do with a add event listener. We're just going to specify what function we want to call up here at the beginning. Don't do it inside the return statement because that's going to make your like, this is all one statement. Don't try to put function declarations inside that code, that statement. That's like really, really messy. Instead, we're going to define it sort of up here as its own variable. And then of course we can log out what this does. You clicked bake. So our function then, right, our onClick says that when we click this baking button, we want to call the handle bake click function. These functions are called event handlers. They're what you do to handle, to deal with an event that occurs. As such, we, by convention, always name them handle something. So you'll see a lot of, in React code, you'll see a lot of handle click, handle submit, handle type, handle move as a way of keeping track of those different pieces. Because I have multiple buttons, I'm going to have multiple different functions, multiple different handlers, right? One to handle each different button. So I'm going to have a handle bake click button, and I can also have a handle eat click button, which I can write this one using arrow function syntax, which is a little bit more common. Either way works. You clicked eat. Either approach works. Arrow function syntax is considered as the normal. That's sort of what you should be doing, but I'm using sort of this function function literal syntax to make sure that's clear that we are creating a function right here. Okay, and then of course in my eat cookie, I can give my eat cookie an onClick as well. This could be handle eat click function. Once that is in place, right? Once you've added that event handler and you've defined what functions, right? What event handling things you want to do, you can then be able to, when you refresh our page, if I now click bake cookie, it says that I clicked bake, right? That was my behavior. Eat cookie says I clicked eat, bake, eat, bake. It all works the way I'd expect. So this is all we need to do in order to add event handling. It works just like add event listener, but instead we're using the special prop called onClick. Awesome. And that handles events. So The next thing we need to then do is actually keep track of, actually update our values, right? So at the moment, the way that my rendering works is I'm taking my data, right? I'm taking my count, my number of cookies, I'm converting that into an array that has that many elements by just using a really basic for loop, and then I'm rendering that number of cookies. So if I want to show more cookies, right? If my count was 6, then I'd actually see 6 cookies. If my count went up to 7, I would see 7 cookies instead. And that's the behavior we want to be able to happen inside of our code. Now here's the trick. You might say, like, okay, well, fine, let's just make it so that when you click on this function, let's just have our count become count plus 1. And similarly, this guy can become, well, here, we'll leave that alone. We'll just start with baking for the moment. So you might say, okay, that's the first thing I want to do, right? That says have my count increase. Fine. If we, oh, here, let's go back to 5, starting at 5. 5 is easy. Well, about 3. 3 is a pretty easy number to start with, but make sure we count it. Right? When I click bake, I immediately get an error. Can't assign a constant variable because I made this function. Okay, that's fine. I can make it let. When I hit bake, you'll notice that it says that I click bake. My event handler is happening, but nothing is actually changing. The reason that nothing is changing is because this function, this cookie jar function, has already returned. It is already done. It's finished displaying what the cookie jar looks like. So that in my app, when I said, please show me a cookie jar, React said, okay, I need to see what a cookie jar looks like. It said, I'm going to render the cookie jar, right? Render that once. It specified a count of 3. It created some event handling functions. It then figured out how many images to show, and then returned all of those cookie elements and put them on the screen. At which point it has returned, this function is done. It is finished. It's not going to be called anymore. So even if my handle bake click increases my counts, nothing changes, right? This doesn't change my returned content because I've already returned that. I've already put it on the screen. So we can't just change this local variable, right? I can't just increase or modify some variable that I've made inside of my cookie jar. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use what is called state. So the React state is a way that lets us keep track of data across function calls, so across rendering components, so that every time this cookie jar is displayed, it can keep track of a variable. It can use some modifying changing value for how many cookies it wants to show. This lets basically components keep track of their internal state, and they can do it sort of across interaction. We use state for interactivity, so for data that can change over time. So things like the number of cookies that we're showing, that's a value that changes over time between within a single usage session, right? When I'm viewing the page, as I'm clicking on things, that value is changing. Stuff like the words bake cookie or cookie jar titles, that stuff's not changing, so that's not part of our state. Our state is really only the data that's going to be changing over time. Okay, so the thing about state is that the state isn't actually stored as a local variable. It's actually stored in a different location outside of that behavior. This is a little bit how like things work with our DOM, right? Is that remember when we were doing DOM level interactions, we talked about how we'd have our functions that define how things look, right? Our rendering functions. That's kind of what our cookie jar is, right? This is a function that returns some DOM display. And then we said that when we click our button, we want to update some state that lives kind of out here, and then we want to re-render and show that new content. So the state data doesn't actually live inside the component. It doesn't even live outside the component, right? It's not up here, right? All variables, everything we're doing within React happens within components. So we don't actually ever define that function, this variable inside here. What we do to create this value and to keep track of it is we're going to use what is called a state hook. A state hook is a special function provided by React that lets us manage state data, variables that are going to sort of keep track of things across renderings, across redisplayings of our components. So they're called hooks because they let you hook into the lifecycle and sort of the way that React runs, and lets you be able to like modify how things are going to appear and what they look like. All state hooks are functions, and they're usually named with the word use. So the function useState represents a state hook or a function that's going to let us be able to use some state data. So we're going to import this useState function from the React library. It's built with and defined by the React library that's going to let us be able to work with that state. Now, great, that gives us our state variable. Now, in order to actually set up and initialize our state variable, we're going to call this function useState. It's just a function. We call it with parentheses like normal. And we're going to pass as an argument, what do we want the initial value to be, right? What value should it start out as? At the moment, we're having our count start off as 3. So I'm going to go ahead and put the 3 inside there as an argument saying that's where we want our state value to be. Now, importantly, this is not stored inside the component. It's not a local variable the same way that count is a local variable. That 3 is stored somewhere else, right? It's stored in your computer's memory, but sort of in a memory, sort of in a different kind of location. I often really think of it as being written as like almost in like a separate file, right? It's almost like here's the state values file, and all I know is that in that state values file, I'm writing down a 3, right? That's the thing I want to have my initial value be. So we have this sort of other kind of file, right? And again, it's not actually another file. It's actually stored in your computer's memory. I'm just using this to demonstrate what that file, to demonstrate like what that memory might be, what you might imagine it to be. So again, not an actual file. It's just it's like a representation of where that data is. But you want to keep track of that. Okay, so this state function lets us specify what we want that initial value to be, right? So when I say use some state, it might look and be like, okay, I have no state. What do you want my state? What do you want the state to be? Oh, start off as being a 3. Got it. Nope, 3. Cool. All right. Step 1. Cool. Now, use state as a function. It lets us specify what value to put inside of this sort of, scratch pad over in memory somewhere. It also then returns a result, right? Result. Because it's a function and all functions return a result, and that's normal. Oh, page is still loading. Okay, so it's going to return a result. If we console log this result, we can see what that result looks like when we load the page. So again, we are calling our component to render it. We are rendering the cookie jar. We are then calling useState to set up a state variable inside of our scratch pad over here. And then we are logging out the result of that function. That result of that function looks like this. The data type of this result is an array. You can tell it's an array because it has square brackets here, and there are 2 elements in the array. One is a 3, and one is a function. That's what the F brackets mean, right? This is a function here. So this is a result array, right? That's what we're actually dealing with here. And the result array has 2 elements inside of it. The first element inside of it is the current value of the state. So we can then think of this as the current value of that state is the thing at results array index 0. That's the current value that's written in the scratch pad. So the way that you can think about what's happening here is that when our component gets rendered, right, we're rendering our cookie jar. We're rendering our cookie jar. We are calling useState. We're saying, hey, component, keep track of some data. Right. Oh gosh, don't do that. Our scratch pad starts out blank before we've done anything else. So we say, hey, we need some data. I need some state. What is the current value of the state? That's what useState is saying. It's basically saying, what is that current value? It goes here and it says, oh, well, I don't have a current value. There's nothing written down yet. So what value should I use? I don't have anything. If I don't have anything, what should I use instead? Oh, well, you should use a 3 instead. So then the React says, oh, okay, I'm going to put a 3 into my scratch pad. That's the current value. And then that 3 is what's going to get assigned, come out of this 0th element of this array. It's going to be assigned to this current value. So the important thing here, right, is that because that current value is the number that's in our state, we can make that the count, right? So instead of having our count be defined as 3 right here, we can say have our count be whatever value is in the state. And that shows our 3 cookies. Similarly, this means that if I said, please initialize as being 4, right, when my component re-renders, again, it says, hey, what's the current state variable? And if nothing's been declared before, right, because it's a fresh reload of the page, it says, I don't have anything. What do you want me to put there? I should put a 4. Great, I put a 4. There's now a 4 in my state, in my scratch pad, and our current count is then going to be 4. Awesome. Great. So that's now letting us take the count, the state variable, and it's now going inside of all of our different renderings. We're able to display what that state looks like. Of course, our buttons still don't work, right? If I click a button, that tries to modify a count, which is just a local variable, which again, we can't do that because this thing here, A, it's constant, which is why it's crashing, but also it's still just a local variable because when I did this, I said, what value is in the state? I asked the state, say, hey, tell me your current value. It said, here's a 3. I put that 3 into a local variable and then use it to render and return. So again, updating that local variable doesn't change anything. So what do we need to do instead? Well, the second value, as I remember how this result was an array, the 0th value, the first value here was our state variable 4, right? The value there. The second thing is a function. That function, right? This function from result array index 1, right? The 1th element here. This function is what's called a state setter function or a state updater function. It is a function that tells us how can I modify this? How can I go change what is written in my scratchpad? My scratchpad is set initially when I first call use state. The very first time if there's nothing there, it gets set initially. If I want to change what's written in my scratchpad, I need to call this separate function. This function I'm going to call set count. The reason I'm calling it set count is because it is a setter. It is changing, it is setting a value in my scratchpad here. And I'm calling it count because that's the name that I called the variable. So this thing, right, this 4 here, I'm calling count locally. So I'm going to call the function that modifies it set count. It changes the count. Now, set count is a function, right? So this is a function here. Because it's a function, I can call that function whenever I want. For example, I can call that function when I click the button. So instead of trying to increase a local variable, right, this is instead of change local variable, right? We don't want to do that. That's bad. Instead, what we can do is we can call set count as a function to say what value do we want to write in the scratchpad. And in this case, I might say take my current value and add 1 to it, right? And put that value in the scratchpad. So what will happen here is that when I click handle bake click, my code, my set count function here, literally all it does is it says take the current count 4, add 1 to it to get 5, and take that 5 and put it inside the scratchpad. So take the 4, replace it with a 5. That's what that function does. When you call set count, it changes the value in the scratchpad. That's the first step it does. The second thing it does, now remember how when we had event handling, we want to modify state, change the scratchpad, and we want to re-render our content? State setter functions, right? These functions that we get from this use state, also, it does 2 things, right? 1, it updates the state, and then 2, it re-renders the component. It will cause this component to get rendered, to get called a second time. It literally calls this function again, goes back up to the top and calls that whole function. So let me show you what this looks like. Right, refresh my page. So here we are to start, right? I've rendered my cookie jar, and here's the results of my use state call. I'm going to hit my bake cookie button. When I click bake cookie, it says that I clicked the bake button, and then it calls set count. Set count updates my scratchpad. So again, it takes what used to be a 4 and then replaces it with a 5, and then calls the function a second time. It calls export function. It calls function cookie jar. So we go back to the top and we start running through these lines of code top to bottom. We go through and we render the cookie jar again. See, there it is. We've rendered it a second time. We then say use state. And when I call use state, I'm saying, hey, scratchpad, what number is currently in the state? And scratchpad says, oh, that's a 5. I say, awesome. That's a 5. So I get that result, that count, right? That 5 is what's in my result array. Right, there it is, the 5. And I put that result in my count. And then when I render decide how many cookies to show, it loops through this 5 times because there are 5 cookies because that's what's in my state variable. Now, the 4 was only used the first time the component was called, right? This first time around. When I click set count, it called the function a second time, which now doesn't use the 4 because now it says, what's the state variable? There's a state variable. Awesome. All right. If I click bake cookie again, right, this says set count to be the 5 plus 1, which is 6, which means we go into my state scratchpad and I replace the 5 with a 6. Step 1. Step 2, we re-render the component, which means we go back to the top. Cookie jar says we're re-rendering a second time. We're calling render cookie jar. It gets to use state and it says, hey, state, what's the count right now? I mean, I don't know, like, where is it? What's it going on? Where are things? Hey, state, what's the count? State says, hey, the count is 6. Awesome. We take that 6, we put it into our count variable, and now when we render our cookies, we can render all 6 of our cookies. So that is how the state updating loop works. Is what we're going to do is we are going to, when you call the setter, it updates your scratchpad and then re-rent calls your function going back to the top. When it calls the function a second time, it calls use state to say what is in the state. It asks it what is that data. It gets that information and then is able to then let us render based on that new value. And that causes us to be able to bake a whole bunch of cookies if we want to. Awesome. All right. Now, syntactically, this works fine, right? We are able to create our results array and able to access the 0th element and the 1th element. This is a little redundant, though, because I'm calling equals result array 0 equals result array 1. That feels a little bit tedious. So what we tend to do instead is we're going to use our array destructuring syntax that we learned previously in order to break that up into a single line of code. So instead of declaring these two values, result array index 0 going to count and 1 going into set count, I'm going to instead say I want to create both variables at once, count and set count, by making them equal to the result array, period. Can't have both of them together, and that makes the thing all work out the way we want. So again, now this is a short syntactic shortcut. Of course, I don't even need a result array in the first place. So really, I could have actually just pulled my use state here and replace, because that's what the result array is, I could have just called it out directly. So the way that we tend to call state variables looks like this. And this is sort of our syntax. We're going to call use state. The 0, the value that goes inside the parentheses, is what we want to initially put in that scratch pad if there was nothing there to begin with. The very first time a component's called, what should go there, that goes inside the parentheses. We are then going to take this result and assign that to 2 different values. The first is going to be the state variable count, for example, which is the thing we actually use when we're rendering in different ways, either outputting it directly, or in this case, I'm using it to define how many arrays I want to create. And then we get our updating function, our state setter function, set count, which is what we use to then actually update the component. So that happens that when we click a button, we update what's in the scratch pad and re-render, which calls the component again, goes back to the top and renders the whole thing so we can see the whole and basically so we can then go say so this writes to the scratch pad, goes back to the top, gets the value out of the scratch pad. It feels a little redundant. It's like I'm putting this value over there and then I'm immediately saying, hey, you, what value did I just tell you? It's a little redundant. Like it feels a little redundant like that, but that's how this React is managing its state. And that's what gives us our state variable so that we can create these kinds of effects. Of course, without too much extra work, we can make it so that our handle eat button sets our count to be count -1. So now I can bake more cookies and I can eat more cookies, right? Each one goes, every time I click this button, either we're setting our count to be a bigger number or a smaller number, and then that always re-renders the component, goes back up to the top, says, hey, what value is currently on the board right now, gets that value and uses it for our rendering work. And that's how we use state to keep track of this data and update that data over time. Okay. So a couple of things around state here, last things. Naming convention matters so much in React. You can name variables and components and functions, whatever you want, but it really matters that you name them the way that the rest of the React world named these things. This is both to make sure that you understand what's going on, that anyone else, like your professor, reads your code, knows what's going on, so that we're able to communicate together as people. So a couple of things that matter about that naming convention, right? We always name component arguments props with an S, right? It's always props with an S, even if we're not using it. We always include it and name it that. And we call the state setter functions set whatever the name of the variable is. Always, right? So this is always set count. It's not update count. It's not add count. It's not increase count. It's always set the count, because that's what we're doing. It's not adding to a function and adding a number or increasing or updating a number. It's always setting it to be what we want it to be. So make sure you always name your functions that. If you decide you want to rename this, right? If I want to rename this thing to be the cookie count, which I can do, that's fine. Then I have to rename this guy as well to make sure he is also, come on, there we go. This guy's also set cookie count, right? We want to make sure those two things match along the way. Okay. Cool. Importantly, and this is important for debugging, React state is actually changed asynchronously. Actually, when you call set state, all that does is it modifies the board, the scratch pad over here. It doesn't actually change any local variables, right? So if I called set count cookie count here, let's just I'm gonna prove it to you. I'm gonna set this to be 10 automatically, right? If I console log my cookie count right here, after setting it to be 10, I said set the cookie count to be 10, and then log out that value. What happens that after, when I said set it to be 10, when I log out the value is still 4, because this cookie count was what I got from the scratch pad up back at the top in the beginning of the function. The value doesn't change, right? I won't get a new cookie count. I won't get that new value out of the scratch pad until I have re-rendered the component and I've come back around to the top. So what that means is that if you want to debug any of your components, if you want to debug any of your state behavior, you can't console log immediately after you set the value, because that doesn't actually change your local variable. That just changes what's in the scratch pad. Instead, what you would need to do is you would want to log out that variable, what is the current state, up here where you first get the current state. When you say, get me what the state is, this is where you log out, count is. That's where you can log out what that data is. So again, in this case, right, my count is 4 initially. When I hit bake cookie, my count jumps up to 10 because that's when I hard coded it to become. Let's go back and make this cookie count +1. And that jumps us to where we need to be. All right. So again, importantly, if you're debugging state, you always want to debug state at the top of the function where you first say, what is the current state for this rendering of the component? Don't try to debug anything when you update it, because again, this only writes to the scratch pad. This says, let's put some new data in the scratch pad. And once we're done with that, then we will rerun this whole component going back to the top to get that information. And that's how we use state. That's how we make things interactive. Again, that's a very simple example, but that's the basis for how we do all levels of interactivity inside of React. So a couple other things to note about that. We can actually have multiple state variables in every component, and we often do. It's very, very common. So I could have one state variable that's my cookie count. I could have another one that could be my apple pie count. I can have another one be my ice cream scoop count. I can keep track of all these different values inside of my single component. They keep track of different bits of state. So we could have a number, you can have strings in state, you can have arrays or objects, any value you might put inside of like data for a component, you can put inside of state. Don't put functions in state. Functions are not part of state. Values are. Okay. So again, the way we call setters is we call setters and we just pass in what do we want the new value to be. That's it. That's how we write state components. Okay. State variable in this case can be an array of objects, and we can sort of work with that more and more details we go. Okay. To summarize, just to finish this together, props, we've got like 2 different data types. We've got props, our inputs here, and we've got state. Prop is for information that doesn't change from that component's perspective, right? Stuff that's always gonna be the same, right? Or that like isn't part of that component's control. So in this case, what number we're starting at, it can be like, or where, there's no props that we're dealing with here. We could create a prop, like maybe what number we want to start as and work with that. But from the component's perspective, when it gets rendered, that's coming from somewhere else, right? It's not really changing. State is that information that changes in response to that user interaction. So the thing you want to be careful of is you want to make sure that these state values, right, this information, this data you're storing is only being tracked in a single location, right? You only have that for that number it's keeping track of the number of the current number of cookies is only in one location. If you try having multiple components or multiple different variables all tracking the same state, they're going to start conflicting with each other and they're going to have a bunch of problems and a bad time. So in general, you want to follow this is what we follow the do not repeat yourself principle, right? Only have data in a single location, right? The number of cookies should be tracked by one component in one state variable. So in short, if a value is coming in as a prop from a parent, right? If some parent says is keeping track, parents keeping track of that value and passing in that data as a prop, then it's not your state. I'm getting it as input from my parent. I'm just going to work with it from there. If that value isn't changing within the page view, it's not state. And if you can compute it based on other values, it's still not state. So you'll notice that what I did here is I kept track of the number of cookies. A number, I didn't actually try to put the elements, the images themselves inside of a state. Don't put HTML elements in state. Don't put functions in state. Think of it as data, like JSON level data, right? Numbers, strings, booleans, arrays, objects. That's the kind of thing that goes inside a state. Okay. Try to keep your state minimal as you can, just so you make sure that you're not having too many variables that end up conflicting and you have to manage multiple things at the same time. Cool. And that's the basic idea of state. That's, again, how we work. We'll do lots more examples of showing modifying state and being able to create more interactions based on that. But this is our fundamental way that we are able to create interactive web pages where I can click on things and the content displayed content changes.